telling that story. And part of that, which overlaps with this one, is I kind of document some of the both licit and illicit incentives for state governments to be in this role. I mean, one is the fact that they're just ripping off farmers and reselling the land at market value, and that's a huge markup, and part of that goes into government coffers. There's also myriad ways in which government officials themselves take more illicit cuts in that. So that's kind of on one part of this. Much of the book is focused on really the consequences of a large special economic zone in Rajasthan for villagers that got their land dispossessed for it. And one component of that, it's just one kind of component of the book, is brokerage, so rural land brokerage. So some fraction of relatively well-connected farmers in this village, disproportionately but not exclusively from the kind of dominant agrarian class and caste, became land brokers, facilitating land sales between fellow villagers and outside investors when this SEZ came to the village and created this massive land boom where the values of farmland increased by a factor of something like 30, within a year. And so I've argued that kind of those brokers they're basically using social capital, understood in the Bourdieuian sense, as kind of an unequal distribution networks that convey kind of personal advantage, not in the the kind of collective Putnamite senses, like that social networks kind of adhere in a village as a whole. These are dominant castes that use their social networks to the city to become land brokers in the land boom, often ripping off fellow villagers and kind of creating a lot of strife and undermining kind of any possibility for solidarity in the village vis-a-vis the SEC and the state. So there's this kind of, between the kind of land broker state, which is the kind of the way that the state is orchestrating large-scale land dispossession in post-civilization India, and the kind of brokers that kind of form a feeding chain around these projects, there was this kind of phenomenon that I kind of kept hearing about, but didn't do that much research into when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork and follow-up research, which was this term land mafia. And you hear this kind of again and again, land mafia, land mafia. But what is the land mafia? And it's in the press, so it's widespread use in the kind of newspapers. So if there's India, people talk about land mafia, sand mafia, coal mafia, water mafia, bus mafia. The sum total of which is said to be Mafia Raj. Okay, as that kind of list makes clear, these mafias appear to abound in natural resource sectors, and it's kind of used in this modular sector-specific way. But my question was, so what actually is this phenomenon? Why that people are kind of applying the term mafia to? So, what is it? Is it really mafia? How does it relate to the land broker states on the one hand and the kind of rural brokers on the other? Is it kind of a distinct phenomenon? Is it overlapping? When did they become so significant? What are their strategies? Who's involved and how are they structured? Who do they target? What are their social consequences? What are the conditions of possibility for their functioning? And what do they tell us about the relationship between the state, neoliberal capitalism, and the countryside in contemporary India? So I have some very preliminary findings. I need to do some significantly more research to feel confident about some of them. And I've also just started dipping into the much larger than I thought literature on mafia studies, which I'm by no means an expert on yet. So please feel free to kind of suggest any readings, any kind of concepts that you might think useful, or if this term mafia corresponds to also something in places you're studying, I'd like to also hear about that. So let me just start by saying a little something about my methods, because you might be curious about that. I've interviewed probably about 3 to 4 people who, under certain definitions, including their own, could be characterized as land mafia. But none of them would call themselves land mafia. No one thinks they're land mafia. And they may not even think of themselves as such. Okay, so I'm going to unpack that a bit more as we go on. 2 of these explicitly explain to me how land mafias operate in those terms and with significant detail. Detail that you'd only have if you were kind of very close to it or kind of in it. These are long-term contacts in Jaipur that I've been kind of informants on the real estate market that I've been interviewing since 2009. These are guys about my age, connected to the BJP, sometimes governments involved in real estate, small-time real estate, small and medium-sized real estate, regional real estate investors. So I built some kind of trust with them over the years. They were just starting out really when I first met them and started interviewing them when I was looking into the SEZ. 2 of them had built developed a few real estate colonies near the special economic zone that I studied. I also mostly interviewed them at kind of bars or cafe coffee day or the kind of small snack stalls where they hang out. The first, I'll call him Om Prakash, is the son of a Rajasthan policeman, former sociology PhD student, but that was, time passed really until he could find something better to do. He's developed 2 real estate colonies with his friend Rajesh. He's actually currently working at a medium-level job in a regional media outlet. His friend Rajesh is a bigger-time real estate player, still not necessarily huge. Trained as an engineer. His wife is a graduate of the Rajasthan Administrative Services and was a kind of acting at a fairly high-level position when I first met him, district-level official. I used to see him kind of stressed, running in and out of the Jaipur Development Authority, where a lot of real estate developers have business, trying to, get their real estate colonies converted and so on, which typically, as he told me, involves significant, payments and so on. Now, when I just saw him, I interviewed him again the last 2 summers, specifically on the Mafia, and he's now living in this huge marble house in a kind of new extension of Jaipur. You could probably drive about 4 chops into his living room, and it's got the whole kind of gate, and and he was doing some work on his neighbor, the minister's house, and so on. So he's kind of moved up a bit in the world, and in August he sat down and explained to me in quite a lot of detail for about 3.5 hours how Land Mafia operates. The others are kind of large brokers in the village I studied. I initially thought of them just as large brokers, though in my last 2 trips I started asking questions about Mafia. A number of people pointed to these people who I just thought of as the kind of large brokers as Mafia. And then I realized, well, by some definitions, yes, they are Mafia. And I'll talk a bit about that. And they're both former sarpanches, village heads of this village. And the rest of the information I take from people like former government officials, including the revenue department, apparently clean sarpanch who has some insight on how this happens, a journalist, a lawyer who's worked on a few cases of land mafias targeting Dalits, a former broker turned Marxist informal labor organizer who had some insight, and then some more peripheral data that came up in my village ethnography. There's even, you can get interesting data on it from taxi and auto rickshaw drivers. Sometimes have interesting stories about land mafia. They couldn't tell me as much detail how it worked as some of the people I interviewed. So in lay terms, what does it refer to? Let me first by saying what I think it's not. It's not like these guys, right? So if anyone's familiar with the genre in India, and this is kind of fun stuff to read in my spare time. But there's all this kind of, people know about the kind of underworld, the Dons, of Mumbai, and the kind of mobsters, and sometimes people refer to, like Dawood's gang and, Kareem Lala and so on as like the Mafia or Dons, and there's a huge, Bollywood genre around that, and a lot of, fun books. I don't think it's that, okay? Though, as some people documented, the kind of old-time, whatever we call them, Mafia mobsters, and kind of, these are diversified criminal organizations that started smuggling. They go to, rackets and gambling and so on, and then they kind of have diversified into land, right, in Mumbai, right, as the land market has become really hot. But that's not, I think, what I'm talking about. I'm not also talking about kind of scams, right? So there's like a lot of books now on scams, and some of those might involve mafias, but there's a kind of large literature on that. And those are kind of huge, cases of corruption that get unearthed. And those might bring some of these things into the surface. So I think what we're talking about is a more kind of everyday activity. So, I just trying to figure out where this term comes from in India. If you have insight, please let me know. I just did a search Times of India historical database, and you see that the term mafia itself is used for a long time in India. I haven't gone through because there's thousands of articles yet. I will. It seems like mostly it's referring to the Italian mafia, right, for a lot of that early history. And at some points, this term becomes a kind of, applying to a more specific set of things, and I think most of the last 30 years or so. I did a search for land mafia in the Times of India, and this is what I found, the number of articles each year kind of mentioning it. What's interesting to me, of course, is that this seems to be a post-liberalization phenomenon, largely. You see India liberalizes substantially a little bit in the late 80s, but really in the early 90s. And it seems that this term gets used a lot in the midst of land booms. Right? So there's a big mid-90s land boom, there's a kind of recession, and then there's a kind of another boom in the 2000s, and that seems to roughly seems to be a term at least that's used in post-liberalization India. And one of my hypotheses, and I don't think I can entirely show it yet, is basically what, not just the term mafia, but what it refers to. It might not be entirely new, but that it's something that has become extremely widespread and is driven in part by neoliberalism and what the reforms have done to the Indian economy as it intersects with other things. So I will come back to that in a bit. Okay, so people that I interview are convinced they're widespread. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them operating, in the periphery of even a kind of regional capital like Jaipur. And basically they use, as a rough orientation, coercive, maybe illegal and coercive methods in connivance with politicians and police to corner land on the cheap. Okay, but we're going to see defining it is a bit tricky. So almost anyone can kind of basically tell you as a nexus and so on. But they also can't really give you a clear definition. I couldn't find anyone to give me a clear definition that would in some ways hive off land mafia from a whole lot of other things that are happening on other sectors of the economy and in land markets more generally. Now if you go to, I've just started this kind of, so I'm by no means an expert on this, but in Michael Watts's review of Anton Bloch's Mafia of the Sicilian Village was the first agrarian classics piece that we ran in JPS, and it's a fantastic essay if you haven't seen it. He talks about these three different ways in which mafias are used. One is the kind of historical concept referring to kind of the socio-cultural configuration in southern Italy. So Anton Bloch is really an amazing classic book, Dutch anthropologist. And he basically refers to them as kind of the violent political economic brokers. They mediate relationship between the locality and the state, where the state is weak, and between agrarian classes in the locality, so where agrarian capitalism is developing. So he kind of situates the mafia in that kind of large sweep of one kind of state formation in southern Italy and the development of commercial capitalism. Arlacchi makes this distinction between a traditional mafia that was kind of more like Bloch talked about it, and also makes a lot of this kind of the code of honor and omerta and all that kind of stuff. But he says there's kind of a shift to an entrepreneurial mafia. So it breaks to bring mafia methods to various economic sectors. They're not just these kind of mediators anymore, but they just bring these kind of resources like skills and private violence to kind of corner construction or any kind of government contract. Gambetta is a sociologist. I'm a sociologist, but I think he's the most reductive of them all. This is considered a classic book, but he has a very narrow economic definition of them as basically an economic enterprise selling private protection. So basically their product is protection, the protection rackets, and they provide protection rackets for other industries, but he doesn't think that they're actually involved in other industries. Lupo kind of has this history where he critiques Arlacchi's dichotomy because he says, well, the traditional mafia was always very entrepreneurial, or more specific, more appropriately, very much involved in commercial capitalism from the beginning, and it's always been, and it just kind of adapts over time. And he says that Gambetta understates how mafia uses violence as a springboard into other sectors, right? So then you have Schneider and Schneider, and they have a more capacious definition that maybe can be useful here. They either mediate illegal traffic, right, or they use illegal means, including violence, to get a foothold in legal activities. So I think what stands out here is that illegal means or violence, and are those things that kind of can help us clearly distinguish mafia from other things. And I'm not 100% sure that holds up, but that's probably the closest. Because many of these things would actually characterize a number of sectors in the economy. Here's some, okay, so then the second is the generic concept referring to kind of structurally similar phenomenon in other places. So you have the Russian mafia, the Japanese mafia, the Turkish mafia, so it's obviously been used broadly. There's a kind of literature I just started dipping into on the kind of globalization of mafia. A lot of it's written by journalists, One is focused on the kind of post-Soviet transition and kind of how mafias emerge out of that and how globalization facilitates, like the Italian mafia, the Yakuza, kind of going global. And then there's a kind of meta-generic colloquial term which kind of encompasses organized crime, the underworld, or particular clusters of kind of social interest. I think that's that overlaps a lot with how it's used in the second literature, and I think it's kind of how it's used in India as a very sort of colloquial term. So I'm not sure that any of this is totally enlightening, but it kind of gives some orientation to the phenomenon, and I think what I'm struggling with is that I'm not sure that these definitions actually work for what we're talking about. So ultimately, I treat kind of mafia as a faux concept, but one that directs me to an important sociological phenomenon, even if the concept of the term is not itself an adequate sociological concept. But I do find Anton Bloch's suggestion in his own classic study of the Sicilian Mafia useful to begin with basically mafia activity. Oops, did I lose that slide? Might have put it in the wrong order. Here it is. So structurally, mafia was thus not a corporate social unit comparable with, for instance, a political party, a secret society, or a village council. In understanding mafia, we should try to disencumber ourselves from the notion of formal corporate groups. So even the kind of traditional Sicilian mafia, he says, is not really that coherent or kind of a clear organization, right? That there's kind of networks, and he suggests that one should focus on mafia activities or kind of incumbents of mafiosi roles. So I find that a useful place to start. And this is sort of, these are the kind of definitions of mafia that kind of my informants would give. So one says mafia means any land deal in which rules are not followed and the owner is compelled or forced to sell on prices which are very less than the market rate. Okay, so basically, not following rules, that's basically puts a lot of weight on illegality and getting land at below market rate. Journalists said mafia generally has a negative connotation. The main thing is the use of force, illegal use of force. So that's also kind of common in some definitions of mafia. Lawyer tells me a very powerful gang, group of people that must be economically powerful and have political support. I think that's also useful because in relation to Gambetta, I think it's clear that these groups work very closely with politicians in the state, and they need political support to operate. Another activist says, I would say anyone who uses the legal means of the mafia, within that club, many people come and go. So the stress on illegal, but that people can move in and out of that role, which I think is right. I said the problem with that definition includes the entire real estate industry, because there's black money everywhere, and almost every transaction role, land markets has black money, and usually involves some kind of bribes and so on. He says exactly, which is mafia, right? So the problem with that is that it's so broad that it's everything. Another says there's a nexus between administration, politicians, and land mafia. Of course, that's a problem because land mafia is in the definition of land mafia, and I kind of pushed him on it. And so then he says, well, there's the land mafia, and then there's the kind of working partner. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So I have a real hard time. This is my biggest empirical problem right now, is figuring out if there's a core, and then there's kind of paying members, and who's the kind of prime mover in the network. I think I have a sense of the people involved, but not like what the core is and who the. So this nexus, though, is a common way of talking about it, and this is also makes it complex. So Rajesh says, no mafia will accept he's mafia, right? And Om Prakash then walks in and says, oh, we're talking about mafia. Talk to him, he's mafia. no, he's mafia, right? So there's that kind of thing, but they never say that they're mafia. But I will talk about that they seem to actually fall into their own definition of mafia. All right, so let's start. This sounds like really confusing. So let's start with kind of what they do. That I got some clarity on. So there's a number of strategies that I had people walk me through in a lot of detail. So farmland. The biggest by far, I think, thing is this exploiting title ambiguities and conflicts within families, kind of undivided family property. So in rural India, you have a lot of large extended family, maybe the grandfather's still alive, they're all kind of living under there with multiple brothers, but it's not, the land's not been divided on paper, so legally with in the land records. So like one way to exploit this is say that, there's three brothers here, and I know you're in a fight because I know I'm a broker in the village who gives me that kind of information. And so I go and buy out the brother with the small share. And then I say to the other two, look, you can't really do anything with the property, I own this, and you better sell out to me at a cheap price. And they say no, and we say, well, look, I'm gonna take possession of the whole thing, or I'm gonna claim the front road access to it, because when you do that, it does not clear that you're on a particular piece of that land, you're at 1/3 state in the whole land. And then, you start intimidating them. Maybe they go to the police, but this is key that you bought out the police, right? So they get rebuffed by the police. They could go to the courts, but that'll take 3 decades, 2 to 3 decades to resolve in courts because of backlog courts, unless you have a huge amount of money to pay bribes. So you kind of it's a brick wall there. And then you keep persisting, and then maybe some big guys with muscles show up and tell you you should settle this. Maybe you go to a politician in the MLA and says, look, I sympathize, but I think these are bad people. You're an upstanding person. I think you should settle with them. And he's basically also paid by the Mafia. He's the one keeping the police. So that's a very probably the most common strategy, various kinds of legal ambiguities. Another one, and this is really insidious, so the Hindu Succession Act was amended in 2005, and this actually for the first time gave women equal land rights as daughters. It's not implemented almost anywhere on a significant scale. The depth of kind of patriarchal social relations, especially in places like Rajasthan, is such that women rarely claim this. So what some of these mafia people are doing now is going to find these daughters and saying, look, you deserve a claim, a share of this property. We'll take it all care of, we'll take care of it for you, and we'll just give you like 20%. And then we're gonna get anything anyway. And and obviously it particularly work if there's kind of a conflict in the family, and they'll give them much lower percentage of it, and bring it to court, and it actually has good chance of succeeding in court. Another way to do it is to encroach or cut off access to neighboring property. So you kind of buy land all around someone, so they don't have road access, and then kind of force them to sell cheaply. Or you kind of just encroach on the neighboring land and kind of claim some of that, and maybe you pay off the pecuary, the land records official, to kind of recognize that. So those are kind of some main tactics with farmland. There's public land. There's a number of other strategies here. So you just take a legal possession. There's a lot of schemes about kind of allotting habitation land, basically to poor, mostly in the village. So one way to do that is kind of maybe they've been cultivating that land and they should have rights to it, but it's not been registered, and so they kind of get the power of attorney for that person and kind of get it done, but push that person off and take possession. There's a lot of kind of complicated ways to do this. Basically, you need to kind of bribe the officials to kind of recognize it. And there's selling temple land, so there's this kind of people call this the Mandir Mafia, the temple mafia. So that's like you have the village, grand priests who have some farmland attached to the temple, but they don't actually own it individually. And there's various ways to basically they'll take that temple land and they'll sell it, make fake deeds to people who are unsuspecting, and then they won't be able to sell their house or whatever they build on it. There's a number of strategies that are kind of related to these with the development of housing colonies, which is often on farmland, so it's not, keep that in mind that this is often housing colonies being built on farmland. So selling the same land or plot to multiple people. So you buy up some farmland, you kind of plot it out, and you sell the same plots to a number of people using fake documents. You can oversell or leave no room for infrastructure. So basically, you're supposed to leave like 70, 30, 60, 40 developed space. Undeveloped space has room for roads and infrastructure, and electricity, and all that stuff. What all these guys do is sell up like 90% of that to is plots. So there's almost no room for roads to get through. It's just a total mess. So that's actually fairly common, and in these kind of unauthorized colonies. Now, the Om Prakash and Rajesh had just told me that this is their number 2 example of what land mafia is, was this strategy. And I said, well, that housing colony that the 2 of you developed like near the SEZ, how much of that did you sell off? They're like 90%. So I was like, that makes you land mafia then, right? Like, no, we're not land mafia. Okay, so that's, I think, the kind of main strategies or tactics that I've heard about. the key with any of these strategies is that they control the police, right, who will stonewall any complaints. They can't get justice in the legal system, and if they need to, they can call on violence. And this is key. I think it's either can be subcontracted private violence. They could have their in-house gundas, right, is the term for the kind of, the muscle. They can be in-house, they can be contracted, but sometimes it's actually just using the police. So it's actually not just private violence, it's private use of public violence. So they'll pay the police to go and intimidate people to get off the land. So I think those are kind of the key elements that are. But so I was trying to map this out. Who are the actors? What's the relationship between them? This looks real confusing, but let me try to unpack it a little bit. At the top, look, is basically you need the money people, right? So there's the investor. I think sometimes that investor is just aggregating land, like the largest formal corporations, multinationals are getting land this way, okay? But they might not. It might just be regional investors. In Jaipur, people were telling me a lot of these were, jewelry, right? So the jewelry merchants in Jaipur that historically have a lot of money, the Banyas, are a lot of the money people here. How much they're involved in the rest of what happens, I can't figure out yet. They'll have a chain of brokers, and that's just like the regular, a lot of this is just how the regular real estate economy works, frankly. You have an investor that might have a broker in Jaipur that then is connected to a number of village brokers, and those brokers are basically going, they'll have brokers in villages, so they know kind of what land's available, who's in conflict, and I think that probably some of those village brokers are just doing regular brokerage deals one day. Actually, I know that this is the case, that they're just doing kind of regular brokerage where you go to the farmer, you negotiate, and that often involves trickery. But you basically have the connection to the farmer, they're in your village, you say, look, I have a buyer, do you want to sell? You kind of negotiate a price, you build trust, you smoke chai. I smoke bidis and have chai for a few weeks, and you close a deal. And so that chain is certainly involved in this. What's probably a bit different is the muscle, on the one hand, which again could be gundas and it could be the state. And I think you need the politicians. You need the politicians because the politicians bring the police on board, like the MLA in particular, the member of legislative assembly, controls police transfers and things like that, and they bring the police on board. And they also have the connections to the officials in places like Urban Development Authority, in Jaipur, the Jaipur Development Authority, land records officials, maybe the village sarpanch. These are the people that you need to undertake the administrative work, to either forge the documents or to kind of convert the land once you have it. So this is the kind of nexus that everyone's talking about, the investor, the politicians, the officials. And so then that's kind of where the farmer gets just kind of trapped. And the land kind of, through any of those strategies, basically kind of makes its way up, it gets cleaned and converted and becomes more valuable, and it's transferred up. And a lot of that, I think, is land winds up being, the end user could be anyone. It could be a huge multinational company, it could be an Indian company, it could be a regional real estate developer, it could just become a politician's, farmhouse. Now, the thing that I'm really unclear about, the thing where it gets even messier here is, so when I ask people about sort of who is really in the mafia, so if we go back to Om Prakash's kind of comment, it says there's a nexus between politicians, administration, and the mafia. So, where is the actual mafia here? And this is also complicated because sometimes the investor could also be the politician or the officials recycling their own black money, right? So sometimes they are the money. And sometimes they're not using muscle, right? They're just using the police. So this gets really kind of confusing. And some days those brokers might be regular brokers. And when I ask for a distinction, some people will say, well, it's the mafia, and then there's the working partners. So they say that the politician or the police, the officials, the land records officials are working partners. So they might get a kind of fixed commission, or kind of some payment according to the services needed from them. The same with the brokers. They kind of get their 2% commission, 1% commission, whatever it is, depending on how many are involved. So then that leaves the question, if there's so many working partners, that leaves the investor. So is it the investor, That is the mafia. But then again, I don't think any of the investors think of themselves as mafia, but they might employ all these people to do these things. And so sometimes it seems to me that they're using mafia to talk to really just about the gundas and the kind of unsavory people they have to use that are of a kind of lower class than them, but who they're colluding with. So this is just honestly where I believe it, because I just really don't know the answer to this yet. Hopefully with some more field work, I'll get a little deeper. But there seems to one hand be, obviously it's a huge network. It crosses the public-private divide, it crosses the state, right? And capital crosses urban and rural, the formal, informal. The whole thing's corrupt, sure, but so are like all real estate markets. There is violence, but it's not always used. And it's not, if you want to use the distinction of private versus public violence, because the state itself is using violence all the time to take land, that sort of works, except then sometimes they're just using the state violence, like it's private use of the state violence. So you see all those definitions are kind of like break down a little bit when you're trying to understand this phenomenon. I'm not just interested in like deconstructing the boundaries and some Timothy Mitchell stuff and boring blah, blah, blah 2 decades ago. But there is something interesting, I feel like, this is telling us about the way the state is relating to capital and the countryside. It's kind of a diffuse, shifting set of people, I think. And I think there's different people involved in any particular deal. So it's kind of overlapping or shifting membership, not necessarily hierarchical, though it could be that there is kind of one person here. And I think it is also the case that what we think of as like gangsters who are involved in other things are putting money into these kinds of things. So it's really complex, and sometimes it's just the state officials themselves that might be inaugurating all this. So the chief minister of Rajasthan, she's notorious for a lot of the land scams that she's been involved in, but people say she's queen of the land mafia. I've heard that lots of times, right? So that's also very hard to kind of demonstrate. So Block has this quote where he says the term mafia, it designates both these informal groupings, so the informal groupings that we think of as the mafia, and the connivance as such, so the connivance between them and the state. Some of the mafia scholars make this distinction between the mafia and the mafia bourgeoisie, right? A whole kind of stratum of lawyers and doctors and other people who are kind of might collaborate or facilitate in some ways the mafia. But it's basically a diffuse chain of rentiership, and it's crossing the public and private, basically public-private partnership. So let me talk, that's about as far as I can go right now. Talk a little bit about the victims or the targets. Basically it's poor and the powerless and the lower caste, and not only. This is what, some of these people who are not mafia, but our mafia tell me. So actually they know who is powerful and who is not. They target the poor person. Right? The mafia always targets the weak person, the disputed property. Generally they target old people. Right? So also put old people's children live outside, really have no one to kind of assist them to kind of deal with this. Sometimes people that have children are a nuclear family person, so some kind of isolated couple maybe. We're talking about actually some urban strategies. Who don't have much kind of cloud or pull or networks or kind of extended family to support them. It's very hard for them to fight kind of average family to fight this and problem. Then NRIs though, so it's not just like the poor. So non-resident Indians. So basically, Indians living in other countries, they're not there on their property. They're soft targets, they're not there, and so on. This can also backfire because he also gave an example of an NRI who was quite connected to the chief minister, and his land was encroached by an MLA who was, land mafia, and he went to the chief minister, and the minister basically sorted it out for them. So if you have that kind of pull, you might be able to rebuff them. Like I said, most target SCST people. This is a lawyer. They can dispossess them very easily. Poor people absolutely cannot win in court. Sometimes the lawyers are also with the mafia. Judges have taken money from the land mafia. So there's a very real kind of acknowledgement that the poor are the main targets, the powerless, and they have very little chance of stopping it through formal channels. And he had given me an example of a case he had taken up with dogs who were driven off their land. Now, another point that I would make is that there also seems to be some fungibility here, or I don't know how to say this, maybe conversion between mafias. So I was also given examples of people who started out I was repeatedly told that the liquor mafia right, also become land mafia. Right? So liquor is notorious, it requires all kinds of political pull to get the contracts, and needs some muscle power to kind of stop competitors who might try to produce this stuff. So that's seen as a kind of mafia, and a particularly kind of harsh one. So I was giving examples of a neighbor of one of these guys who says, oh, I'm the biggest land mafia. But also when I was there in the summer, the kind of land market had gone down, right? So actually the real estate market is slumped in much of India and in Jaipur. And so they say, well, these land mafia are now going to other things, like kind of education mafia, right? So education, they start medical colleges or engineering colleges, right? They're basically diploma mills for profit, which is kind of possible since higher education has been privatized in India. And so that's a whole other, and often it also involves land grab, and milking kind of rural farmers with some money for tuition, for basically worthless degrees. So I'm almost done, but how much time am I?
Yeah, you have 1 minute left.
Okay.
That's very short time.
Perfect. I might take 2, that's okay.
Okay, yes.
So what are the conditions of possibility for this kind of working? They might help us understand where this comes from or explain it. One is, it seems to me, obviously there's a dramatically rising land market, and that's really a product of India's need for reforms, liberalize the real estate market and create this kind of huge rush. So we have rural land values in India that rival those in the U.S. They're actually higher in many places. Well, the brokers in this village I studied kept asking me to invest in farmland. I can't afford that. I mean, it's just, it's the land is so expensive. It's more expensive than Baltimore, where I live. But so obviously it's a booming market, and that kind of confronts a few supply obstacles in rural land markets. So unclear titles is part of it. I don't think it's all of it. Obviously, there's a lot of people that are going to put all the weight on that, and I don't think that that's it. Joint family property is another. So in some sense, the kind of Hindu joint family is a kind of sociological opportunity for the mafia. And then farmer unwillingness to sell, right? And that's so it creates an inelastic supply of rural land, and that's reinforced by exclusionary growth. That's a lot of what my book is kind of arguing. Farmers have very little interest in relinquishing land because there's so few off-farm possibilities because of the trajectory of non-labor intensive growth in India. State structures and state officials devoted to dispossessing land from farmers for private real estate capital. And I'm thinking, should I see this as basically a shadow land broker state? It's kind of, the states are doing this above board in many ways, and it seems to create opportunities and to kind of orient officials to the possibilities for arbitraging on land through various kinds of illegal means. An ineffective justice system, especially for the poor, is certainly a component of it. The brick wall, going to court. Also, though important, I think, is highly unequal agrarian social structures. It's a product of incomplete land reforms and the developmentalist period, and furnishes the supply of rent-seeking brokers with social capital, so social networks to the city, and they disproportionately come from dominant agrarian classes. So in a sense, the mafia is a kind of, I think, are basically the brokers with more social capital and connections to the state and willing to use violence. And I think the regular brokers some days are mafia other days. And then, of course, it also furnishes a supply of poor, relatively powerless victims that can be targeted by the mafia. That's basically my last point. But in conclusion, I mean, what does this really tell us about state and capitalism in relation to rural India and the kind of adequacy of terms like mafia raj or an analogous term like crony capitalism to really tell us anything about it? I think that good governance reform and so on, land titling digitalization is kind of what's often put forward as a solution. That won't deal with kind of, at best, that kind of will deal with the point 1 of point 2. Maybe reforming the legal system helps, certainly. But it doesn't get rid of these other features, right? Certainly no one's interested in like transforming agrarian social structures or doing land reform. And 1 and 3 are really clear products of neoliberal capitalism in India and are being only reinforced as it moves forward. So that is, leads me to kind of wonder also whether not only are these terms might not be adequate, but whether they also actually serve an ideological function, right? In the sense that they preserve this idea, because we say, oh, well, look at, this is Mafia Raj and so on, and this is crony capitalism, that like only if we reform more, we liberalize more, then we'll have the kind of ideal, typical Smithian liberal capitalism, right? That Hayek, that we should expect, right? And then basically these categories are used to kind of as ad hoc ways of explaining away the deviation from that norm. When in fact, and since these phenomena are being driven by the reforms that are supposed to bring about that end state, it's kind of like Durkheim's abnormal forms. If you read Division of Labor, you get to the very end, and he says this is kind of how society functions. But then there's the abnormal forms, right? When the division of labor is forced or anomic and all that, and then you realize that actually that's how it actually is. And the whole book was kind of this like ideal, vision. And so whether it's just this kind of has this ideological function of crony capitalism, Mafia Raj, and it's kind of a mystification actually of what's happening, and it mistakes these things as deviations from or obstacles to a kind of liberal market capitalism when in fact they're the apotheosis of liberal market capitalism in these conditions. Okay, so I'll stop there and look forward to your feedback. Thanks.
So we'll have no time for questions. I propose we do a round of questions, so a couple of people can ask questions, so Michael can address them maybe a bit coherently, and then we go towards another round. So, any questions at this moment? Yeah.
Hi, that was a great lecture. So I wonder, how do we really differentiate between land brokers and mafia? Because there can be so many things which can appear legal, but they are not necessarily legal because there's so much in background that's happening. Especially in Haryana and Rajasthan both, there was a dramatic rise of land prices due to various factors, and people were selling their lands overnight and stuff. So how do we really differentiate between these two categories? Yeah.
Thanks. Great question. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was quite interesting. I'm wondering if you might find it useful to look at it more from an institutional angle rather than from looking for a particular group or a particular set of behaviors. Institutionally, when you organize things into 3 units instead of 2, there are legal things, there are informal but legitimate activities, local business norms, etc. And then there are informal but socially disapproved of activities. And usually a lot of the mafia literature focuses on things that are disapproved of even by people who feel that informal forms of business are fine as long as they're done according to socially recognized institutions. So it's a form of economic organization and regulation that is involves violent regulation rather than institutionalized process, that involves illegal activity, not just the enforcement of, say, eminent domain or whatever, but actually outside the law. And is not normally even by local business people regarded as appropriate behavior, even if they do it, they know that what they're doing is incorrect. So looking at it in terms of modes of regulation, and I would think that the link with primitive accumulation, and what's going on here are forms of primitive accumulation, but as your book suggests, there are forms of primitive accumulation that are channeling wealth in ways that are not socially constructive. But then again, the Rockefellers were once robber barons, who's to say in 40 years?
Thanks. Great question. I guess that is
Okay.
so.
Yeah, that's a lot. Let me start with the first one. I think that Look, I think someone could be a broker one day and mafia the other, right? Or they could be engaged in kind of regular brokerage one day and kind of mafia activity another. I think it's a Venn diagram. I think they overlap, but they're not reducible to each other. So I think that I don't know how to separate them except by looking at the activity. And I think that basically the mafia, if we're going to use that distinction, I mean, I think that what it refers to anyway is a kind of activity that it's brokerage, but it relies on state connection with violence, basically, or some kind of threat or intimidation. I mean, just looking at it as corruption or illegality is also difficult. There's a lot that can be illegal about just the regular land brokerage that happens. And it's very hard to separate because there's a lot of just land brokers that cheat people in the sense that they go and tell a Dalit to who's illiterate and say, I have plenty of examples of this, sell 2 bigas of your land and the contract says 4 and the farmer doesn't know. So that happens. They also obviously don't tell farmers what they know about what's going to happen to land prices. But I think that basically if I was going to make a distinction, it would be the brokers who are systematically using these ties to the state, the politicians and the police to search out land that has either disputed or has some kind of legal ambiguity and kind of backed up by either private violence or kind of private use of public violence. And I'd say probably with that definition there would be at least 3 or 4 of the brokers I interviewed in the village I studied who would come under that category, and then more brokers that did not. The second one, I guess I don't know. It's a good set of suggestions, and I just don't know that the typologies help that much, or that the typologies don't clearly distinguish things. Like ideal types don't clearly map on to what's happening. Because to legal, informal but legitimate, and there's legal, illegal, there's formal, there's informal, there's legitimate, illegitimate. Those would all be separate things, could all be combined in different ways. There's a lot of things the state does that are formal and institutionalized but considered illegitimate. There are a lot of other informal activities that are not violent and considered illegitimate. There's some that are considered legitimate. And I guess what it seems to me like it's a network that crosses all these institutions, but doesn't, it's kind of a porous set of networks crossing the state and rural farmers and private capital. And I'm just not sure how to make sense of it in a kind of institutional way. I'm struggling with that. Modes of regulation, I don't know that it's regulation. I mean, I think they're basically forms of dispossession. They're forms of upward redistribution. They're organized in different ways, but also ways that are overlapping. And by almost every definition, it's very hard to separate these activities. So the brokerage versus mafia is very hard. The mafia dispossession versus state dispossession is, it's also a kind of thin line. But there is a line, I think, but it's a thin line. Almost every sector of the Indian economy, like if you look at arms procurement or involves black money, involves bribes, can involve intimidation. So it's just hard to hive off, these things in any kind of with a stable definition. Permanent accumulation, actually, the book is arguing that that's a faux concept, and it doesn't actually explain anything either. That it was a historical term about how capitalism developed in England, and it's not actually even useful for understanding how states are grabbing land, which is not original, it's not primary, it's kind of ongoing land dispossessions of advanced capitalism, things that people. So I kind of argue you can leave that term alone, except maybe for talking about rural England and enclosures and the initial colonial plunder. Because so the book is arguing that we kind of should get away from that and start thinking about regimes of dispossession as the kind of way to think about state-driven dispossessions. And then now this is kind of my attempt to understand what is the kind of other form of decentralized dispossession, that form of feeding chains, that kind of form of state dispossession. But maybe I'm just not getting the institutional analysis, so we could talk more afterwards, possibly.
Great. We can have some more questions. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. First, I'd like to ask if you think the idea of seeing this as a sort of transition is helpful. because in my research, like in an agricultural country in Brazil, it does seem like there's this sort of frenzy going on of illegal appropriation around this valuation of land and agricultural expansion. But it also does seem like it's perhaps preceding this regularized land market that still doesn't exist. So there's still a lot of unclear titles, unclaimed land. So on the one hand, it might be a transition, I don't know. And I'd like to ask if you see it perhaps as that as well. But my second question, I think, builds on the fact that I also think that's problematic. And as you said, it's really difficult as well. Like, what is mafia? What is broker? What is regularized? What is irregular? So I wanted to ask if you're also considering a more like, cross-historical or even cross-geographical comparative approach to really refine these distinctions in this definition of mafia. Because I think this appeared in the other questions. Like, I really do have this doubt. If you look closer to these brokers, aren't they also appealing to, say, connections? Aren't they also employing violence? Or has the law simply not already crystallized this sort of violence, or this like frontier legal illegal? So yeah, do you think a comparative approach might help to show how the regular land market or the regular brokers are also employing this violence and also in this frontier of legal illegal?
Great questions, yeah.
My question refers to methodology, and it's really a question of curiosity because I don't have any experience of this type of field research in a, let's say, difficult, at least, context. So the quotes you were referring to are what people are saying. So I would like to know a little bit more about how can you validate, in a way, the data that you get. What else do you do other than talking to people? And I mean, people can tell you anything about what they think about others, and especially when it comes to mafia structures. Or so, how do you deal with this problem to go beyond, let's say, social constructions or of the other, talking about illicit business? Really, I don't want to question you on that or say that it's not worth it. I just don't have any experience of how to deal with these questions.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I've also been struggling to understand and make sense of these illicit, illegal practices by state officials, non-state officials, and I don't know, instead of trying to think of land mafia as an entity, to think of it as a form of governmentality, the government, and to uphold the law, they have to break the law, police officials specifically. And so when you talk about ineffective justice system, it's not only there, you see it in places like South Africa, in the United States, everywhere, that it's actually foundational to these liberal forms of government. And that the way that you describe this land mafia, specifically related to land, that it just seems as part of a way of doing. And when you talked about time and what's normal and abnormal, that seems to me, what you're describing. That it's more of a art of governmentality.
Yeah, go ahead.
My question kind of takes off from there because I too am interested more in what you said really towards the end of your discussion, where you said that these and you argued that there was an illogical function that land mafia as a category may serve, and I agree with that. And I was thinking that while the category may itself be illogical because it seems to be this catch-all phrase which everyone seems to be using, there is sense in trying to understand it through the processes which constitute these, which makes it, what it is, rather than as a thing in itself. And if you think, also in the context of neoliberal India, there is an inevitability to it. As my colleague before me argued, that maybe it is part of the system, and it's not an exception, as we might want to think.
Okay, nice links, I guess.
Good. So, about transitioning to grain transition.
Yeah, or also in terms also of property, like having a regular land market with private property.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't know about the second use of transition that way, but in terms of agrarian transition, I think it's basically these are processes that are operating orthogonal to the processes that we tend to think of as agrarian transition, right? In the classic Byers, Bernstein kind of sense. And that, you know, you have the kind of uneven development of capitalism in various parts of agrarian capitalism in different parts of India, but then you have this kind of land boom and this kind of orthogonal process of land grabbing state and non-state for real estate capital, right? So it's a process, to me, that I see is kind of quite orthogonal to the kind of stalled and uneven process of agrarian, let's just say, development of capitalism and agriculture. Which I think is more or less developed very unevenly across India. So no, I don't kind of see it as like part of that process. I see it as kind of orthogonal. I mean, yeah, you know, there's land markets, right? Land markets and so on. And there's things that could make them more perfect capitalist land markets, certainly. But they're there, right? And you know, it's probably like 10 or 15% of land, you know, in a plots in a peri-urban area might have some kind of ambiguity type, right? So it's enough to create a lot of opportunity, but it's also not the kind of like non-existent land market. Comparison, absolutely. So I've only started in Rajasthan because I have access. I'd like to look at other states. I'd also like to, as I read more, look at other countries. And that's why I'm curious if any other places that you're studying, there's something like this, or are people using this term Mafia, and does it correspond to something similar? So that's absolutely, I scribbled something about brokers that I can't read. Yeah, you know, the thing about brokers, again, is that, you know, brokers are often doing illegal things. It's almost all black money they're dealing with. But I don't think all brokers are using violence. So I think that is probably the one clearer thing that you could draw a distinction, where you draw the distinction. But again, you know, intimidation, there's a spectrum there. Certainly when you're employing kind of gundas to come and rough people up, so that's different, right? But employing those typological distinctions also doesn't necessarily help you understand the phenomenon either, right? When you have a nice box around it. So that's where I'm still struggling. And I think, you know, to get to the methodological point, that's why I need more field work. This is very preliminary stage, but let me say something a little bit about that. So the one reason that I think that it's possible to study this is, again, because no one thinks of themselves as a mafia, right? So you can take other people's definitions of mafia, and you can put those in your heads, talk to people that think of themselves as legitimate real estate people, and they can tell you a lot about how it functions. That falls into that category of mafia by most of the definitions. Most of them will engage in some of these activities. But again, I'm using mafia not necessarily yet as my analytical concept, but as a kind of entryway into a phenomenon that I don't feel like I necessarily have the concepts yet to understand adequately. But in terms of methods, so in terms of like the clearer thing, that, I mean, when people tell you a definition, that's a lot looser, right? And that's kind of asking people themselves to be sociologists in a way. The strategies, that's a little easier because you can see that they're valid, you have consistency across interviews. You see that there's also court cases that kind of allege that kind of things happens. They're also in the newspapers. So I think one way is to just sort of cross-check that and see how much, I wouldn't use kind of one interview to say this is a huge phenomenon. But I think if you see it across a number of other sources, that you can start to be a little bit more clear about it. The other thing I'm going to start looking more seriously in court cases and newspaper articles. So there's a bunch of Times of India, several hundred, 1,000 I need to start going through. And then I'm going to start interviewing victims, and I think that'll be the other way to get into it. There's a lot of peripheral characters, in the state administration that are close enough that they can tell you a lot about how it's happening, about these kinds of activities. Then I think victims would be the next step to get deeper, as well as hang out with more of these J4 people and kind of, buying beers and getting a little further into it. And again, no one thinks of themselves as mafia that I've found yet. Probably some of these liquor guys maybe do. They might also probably just call themselves liquor businessmen. Governmentality, I guess I have to say I'm not agnostic on that. I just don't know what else that explains, almost ever, honestly. But, Yeah, I see the temptation there because there's a state, there's kind of some kind of unclear relationship between sort of some decentralized use of power and a kind of state use of power. They're not easy to disentangle. Governmentality, you know, is it operating on populations, you know, on that level? That's what I don't, you know, and there's a much clearer connection to capitalism and agrarian social structures that doesn't come through in Foucault. So I guess I'll have to think about that a bit more. And there was one other inevitability. Yeah, I you know. I don't
How
have
else do you explain this way of doing, this practice? You know?
yeah.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
my work.
I mean, right now I'm just trying to say, what you know, what are the social forces that are coming together to produce this phenomenon? So far, this is what I have. And so the question would be, to get at this would be look at other places where some of these are present, some of them are not, and how does that produce different kind of outcomes? I think that helps us to see. So I think that's, you know, the comparative point. And looking at other countries and seeing then as these different kinds of forces have